Even BlackRock now is recommending 1 to 2% in everyone's portfolio. Obviously, this makes a whole lot of sense. They have their ETF. They've been hoarding as much Bitcoin as they can. And now they're recommending everyone to at least go buy 1 to 2% and stuff it in their portfolio because it makes sense. And here's the kicker too. They think, okay, the biggest returns are coming up. Not that the biggest returns have been, have been surpassed. Not the biggest return, like the previous holders, they haven't seen the biggest return. The biggest returns are still in the future, leading up to large-scale adoption. And we know large-scale adoption hasn't come yet. We know because of the Microsoft shareholder vote. 0.55% of the shareholders voted to add Bitcoin to their balance sheet. That shows you how far away from large-scale adoption we are. So BlackRock thinks that the biggest returns are still very far away when we get large-scale adoption. So think about it. So what does that mean? That Bitcoin's going to go in tens of millions, hundreds of millions in the future when we do have 8 billion people trying to FOMO in? Maybe. Bitcoin indicator echoes early November vibe that presaged a 40% price explosion. Well, that sounds pretty good. So what happened there? I remember talking about this. This is talking about Bollinger Band and how that it was a tightening of the Bollinger Band, right? Like it was a squeeze. And when you squeeze it enough, it causes an explosion, all right? And I remember talking about it before, and there wasn't a lot happening until, boom, we started going upwards, right? So we're seeing that right now. Like after we broke upwards, it's been, basically Bollinger Bands just measures like volatility. And our volatility so far has been almost non-existent since we've got into the 90s, right? And now into the 100s. Like we had basically no dips at all, right? Before, you guys remember, in the 60s and a little bit in the 70s, we had some massive dips. Remember going from like 70 down to like 50,000? Like those were like massive dips. Ever since we got into the 90s, have we fallen from like 90 down to 70? No. Have we fallen to 80? No. The biggest drop we have seen in the 90s is like 99 down to 92. That was the biggest drop we have seen. It's been really stable, right? So that's why Bollinger Band is basically, it's narrowing, and that's what's showing. Usually when you go through this like very narrow gap, something big is going to happen. Like you either explode upwards or downwards, but the way the market is, it's looking like it's probably going to explode upwards in a big way, right? Right before the end of the year. That's what it looks like. Especially also when you compound that with all the Bitcoin that's leaving too, the supply shock that's happening. Look at this headline. Bitcoin is leaving exchanges in batches of 10 million or more. So every single time, you're seeing these transfers out of Coinbase or Crypto.com or wherever. They're in huge chunks, right? So whales, ETFs, whoever, when they're buying by the boatload. It's not small amounts. The supply shock is real. Again, not a whole lot of people pay attention to this, but this is happening in front of our eyes. This is the reason why Bitcoin is 6 digits, 6 figures. I've been talking about this for years. What happens when Bitcoin finally hits 6 figures? It's like this big psychological moment that has finally come. But I still think people just think it's just a number. I don't think people have really grasped what that means. Like, have you guys really thought about it takes $100,000 to buy a single Bitcoin? $101,000 to buy a single Bitcoin. How many people on this planet or in this country or in your neighborhood has the ability at this point in time to go withdraw $101,000 from their bank account to go buy a single Bitcoin? I mean, just take a second to think about that. It's less than 1%. It's probably less than that. At this point in time, you go ask them to do it. How many people have the ability right now in real time to be able to withdraw $100,000 to buy a single Bitcoin right now? I'd say it's less than 1% out there, right? It's insanely impressive to hold one Bitcoin. It really is. And people don't realize that. I mean, right now it's just the number that's out there, but if you really grasp the gravity of what this means, it's actually quite insane. And it's going to get more insane because it's not going to stop. Japan, there's a parliament member, what's the name? Satoshi Hamada. He's proposing it, that Japan should create a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Russia, including Putin has been saying some good stuff about Bitcoin. You got to think he's looking at the U.S. Russia's thinking about creating a strategic reserve. You got to think China is looking at the U.S., looking at it too. They're probably creating a strategic reserve. I mean, come on. There's just not enough to go around, guys. You just have to put two and two together. You got to grab what you can, okay, before it becomes too expensive. And of course, all this is going to lead to some crazy, crazy prices in 2025. 160 in 2025. That's cakewalk. We're going to go a lot higher than 160. Actually, in the next 2 weeks, we might come close to 160. Okay, considering what we did in November and early December, we may come really close to that 160 by the end of December, right? Who knows where we will be by the end of 2025. There are some crazy, crazy speculation numbers. But you know what? If we're following anything close to some of the previous cycles, let's say the 2017 cycle, which we're mimicking pretty closely from from a day's perspective, from even an angle perspective in terms of our movement. I mean, if we're mimicking that, by the end of 2025, we're going to be ending up somewhere between $480,000 and $800,000. And it sounds so far-fetched. It sounds like it's impossible, but just pay attention to what I've been saying. Pay attention to the landscape and how it's going to be so different with a new type of SEC leading the way in America next year. And look at the supply shock that's happening. Look at the countries, the top countries of the world, the G7 nations that will be implementing a strategic reserve of Bitcoin, and they will be buying not just billions, possibly hundreds of billions to trillions dollars worth of Bitcoin next year. Is it really so far-fetched to think that if those things happen, that Bitcoin could be at 500,000 next year? I don't think so. I don't think that's far-fetched at all.